Welcome everyone to our Artivism, the Power of Art to Transform Society initiative and talk today. Just as a reminder, our presentation will be recorded. I'll pass it right along to Dr. Lake, who will introduce our student ambassador for today. And as the night progresses, we'll get to chat a bit more. So, Dr. Lake, take it away. Welcome everyone.
Hello, welcome all. We are very excited that we have our student ambassador for the day, Tamar Bernstein. She's a senior studio art major concentrating in printmaking. She uses her work to talk about the cycle of trauma from past relationships and healing in the present. Her goal is to connect with people about mental health and normalizing that conversation. Please give a big welcome to Tamar.
Hello, everyone. So I'm sorry that you cannot see me, but that is my photo. Very exciting. So I'm going to take you a little bit through my work. And pretty much what my thesis pretty much states is exactly that. I love to make a whole bunch of prints and I let them sit just like the memories of my family do in my own mind, right? I speak a lot about, the traumas of my brother, the fact that he was a drug addict and an alcoholic. A lot of my work takes me through the emotional pain that I've dealt with in my past. So I tend to take my prints, they're very large. I rip them up, I let them just be and exist on the page as they are. I enjoy working as they are. I love to just keep them simplistic, let the emotions drive me. I let my emotions do the work for me. And I just keep making one print after the other. I let the ghost print work as well. So I make one print, I print it again. I let the pages do what they need to. Oftentimes I'll also burn my work. I'll put other elements in them. And I just keep going as the emotions tend to take me through. So this is one of my most recent works. I'll go back to them. I look at them, I let them sit, and I just keep them going, right? I'm putting things now more physically into my work, right? Just like the gauze has sat on my brother as he has done things to himself. This is pretty much kind of where these emotions take me. And we just kind of keep going from there. I've really enjoyed these processes. And I just end up tearing my prints. I work through them. And it's a constant rediscovery of myself. Reworking my prints becomes a way of reworking who I am. And it just becomes a reflection of myself. These guitar strings are very evocative of my brother when he was in rehab. He loved to play guitar, so I've started to put them into my prints as a more physical element of kind of what I've worked with, and I've really enjoyed that process. So now that I've kind of done that, I would like to introduce our presenter today, Professor Hannah Allen. So Hannah Smith Allen is a contemporary artist, and she's the recipient of a 2007 Individual Photographer's Fellowship from Aaron Siskin Foundation, and a 2010 Artist Fellowship in Photography from the New York Foundation for the Arts, and a 2011 AIM residency at the Bronx Museum of Art. She has participated in residencies at Air Gallery and the Lower East Side Print Shop, and her work has been exhibited in venues nationwide, such as the Phoenix Art Museum, Wave Hill Cultural Center, and SF Camera Work. Her writings on contemporary photography have appeared in American Photo and Afterimage, and Professor Hannah Allen is our assistant professor of photography and digital media at Adelphi University and holds degrees in photography from the School of Visual Arts and the Rhode Island School of Design. Her book Borderlands will be available in VSW Press in February of 2021. Please welcome Professor Hannah Smith Allen.
Guess I got to unmute myself now. I am going to share my screen and then I'll get started. It's funny because I see I have a lot. So I put this on Instagram and I don't feel like I do a lot of sharing about my artwork in my social life. So it's really interesting to see a lot of my friends from my social life here. And it actually puts me on edge a little bit. But I will nevertheless go through this. So I want to thank Carolina and Stephanie Lake, Dr. Lake, and RG for putting, and everyone else who's been putting this series together. So it's called Artivism, and it's the, sorry, now I'm stumbling on it, but the power of art. Help me out here, Carolina. The power of art. What's your tagline here?
For social transformation.
For social transformation. So I want to thank you guys for inviting me to speak. My work is not sort of direct action the way I think that often sort of like this idea of art and activism goes together. It's kind of quieter and more subtle. And nevertheless, I think that there is sort of a place for thinking about so in sort of quiet, more intellectual, maybe in sort of a more probing intellectual way, how we can begin to reimagine sort of our landscape and our world. This project, and it's funny, I was thinking about the last time I presented this project at Adelphi here at the Nexus building. I think it was the winter of 2019. So none of us knew. We were all packed in this tiny little room there was maybe 60 or 70 students. Some people were standing in the back, some people were sitting at the front of the classroom. And it was a couple of months before we went into lockdown. And I don't think none of us knew what was sort of coming our way. And I just think about that moment and when I was sharing the work and sharing sort of where I was at. And I often think about this time that we've been in quarantine as really quiet and slow. And it's amazing to sort of look back at where I was when I gave the talk and then where I am now with my work. And maybe it's something, I mean, through all the trauma and the pain that we've all been experiencing, maybe sort of that quiet and slowness doesn't necessarily mean not being productive. And I think that's something to sort of think about as we're sort of moving forward and imagining quite literally what the world we're going to sort of emerge into is going to be. So this work is titled Borderlands. And when I originally presented this a year and a half ago, I was still very much the building phase of it. I was sort of, I had been photographing at the American Southwest border or southern border. I had been sort of collecting images on the border and starting to think about sort of all the different ways that we imagine and picture the landscape. But I hadn't put the pieces of the project together yet. And I sort of was trying to think about how do you put the pieces and all the concepts together into a physical form so that the work sort of resonates with each other and there's a more cohesive statement here. So this is sort of like part 2 of that original discussion where I'm starting to, where I'm presenting sort of how the work literally came together. So basically after I had presented, I had applied for a residency at the Visual Studies Workshop, which is out in Rochester, New York. And it's been around for decades. They have a press. They have a graduate school. They run sort of interdisciplinary program. They have a collection, a very extensive image collection, and they do a lot of thinking about the relationship of ideas and text and images in sort of all its incarnations. And I got this residency, which was slated to begin, I think it was either May or June, but as we all sort of went into lockdown, it became very clear that I wasn't going anywhere. And the residency that I had applied for was really about taking this series that I had been working on the American border, the southern border, and turning it into a book. I've always gravitated towards bookmaking, I think for a lot of reasons. One is that my work I tend to work sort of with sort of all these different concepts, and the book sort of becomes a necessary vessel for all these things to come together and to sort of force juxtapositions between different ideas and different images into sort of a common form. So I had originally proposed setting up this book, and it was something that, because of the nature of the residency, you have a month-long residency up in Rochester, and you're working with the presses and they're in their studios, that it was going to really be fast-tracked. So what COVID actually did was allow me to slow down and sort of take my time really thinking about what this book would become. So what was going to be sort of a fast-tracked residency to try to figure out the form of the book in about a month became sort of something that could be slow and deliberate. So I worked through the summer and into through the end of the spring, through the summer and into the fall. And then the production of the book also took quite a while. And I got to really mull over sort of what the form of this book could be. The original proposal that I submitted was an accordion book. So that idea of the physicality of the book itself, mimicking the actual physicality of the wall, was inherent in the design of the book. But then how these images were going to come together, that was sort of the problem that I mulled over, and I made little maquettes of what the book could become. I went through different design iterations, and then it was the text that really allowed me to think of this as a whole. So what we're looking at here is the dust jacket. It's an orange folded dust jacket that sort of cradles the book itself. It has a hand printed silk screen on the surface of it, sort of that's printed in a translucent ink, so it looks sort of like a mirage, and then die cut into the book, it's into the surface of the dust jacket is a series of holes that really mimic the literal holes in the wall. So if you ever go up to sort of portions of the border wall, you see that your vision is very truncated, and then like you have little slices or slivers of life on the other side. So I sort of thought about that in terms of the book design. This is the cover of the book. The work itself really addresses the American landscape, the American border landscape, and thinking about it and how, not just how it looks, but how it's pictured or how it's imaged. So on the left-hand side, you have a photograph of the actual border wall. And then on the right-hand side is an image from Google Earth of the border wall and how it's imagined online. So that's sort of that's part of the book itself. So I'll sort of start with a little bit of backstory, and then I'm really going to talk about the book form, because that's the part that a lot of the Adelphi students haven't heard me talk about up until this point. What you're looking at here is an image that was lifted from Google Earth. So it's not an image that I literally took with a camera. It's an image that I experienced. It's not an image that you can take by doing a simple screen capture. I actually had to videotape myself engaging with Google Earth and then lifting the video stills out of the image. And so what you're looking at is essentially what I noticed as I was looking over and over again at the views of the borderland, really thinking about it was post the 2016 presidential election and listening to Trump's at that time, all his promises about the border wall and all the mantras that he sort of elicited and all the emotion that he got out of people. My work has always really been about the American landscape and sort of the American history and the American border. I mean, not the border itself, but sort of what that landscape means. And so I was sort of propelled after the election to look at the sort of digital terrain and start to think about what was this place that was in the news that incited so much passion? What did the physical landscape look like? And one of the things that I happened upon is that, and this is I don't know if it's by design or on accident, but there are portions in the digital border, the border wall itself, where the Google Earth no longer operates like you expect it to. So when you expect it, when you hit a physical terrain like a wall or a house or a building or a tree, you never click through it when you're navigating Google Earth. For those of you, it's Google Earth is basically like Google Maps, right? But it's the visual, the photographic version of it. So it operates, for all intents and purposes, it really does operate the way you operate when you're standing there in the physical place. You can't go through walls, you can't go through edifices. But whether this is through by design or sort of by a glitch, there are portions of the border wall where you can click through to the other side. And I don't know of any other way of describing it. You're looking at it here, the pixels start to break open and you see into the other side. When I figured this out, and it was just sort of a research error, I was thinking about what am I going to start a project on? Here it is. When I figured out that moment, it sort of, I felt like I had discovered something that revealed, like, that somehow revealed or encapsulated some of the intentions that were in the news at that time. So what I'm going to do is read you an excerpt from an essay I wrote that was published in Afterimage in the fall of 2020. So while I was working on this book, I had written this essay before. Afterimage is called Afterimage. It's a journal of media arts and cultural criticism. It's run by the University of California Press. And I had published an essay that was really about my travels, both in the digital and the physical border, and trying to make sense of it. So I want to sort of preface this talk in some of the quotes from this essay, so you start to sort of see my sort of slow, meditative kind of activism or artivism, as this talk refers to. So this describes sort of that moment where I realized that the border, the digital border, sort of broke apart and you could look at the other side. In Calexico, California, I found that glitches in the digital border that allowed me to click through the wall and enter ghost-like into Mexico. Initially, I felt a rush. I was in Mexico. This imperfect digital mirror, which reflected my country, allowed me to slip through its walls. Had I found a virtual border crossing? It seemed to me the perfect symbol for our fragile nation, for our fragile, sorry, my computer's glitching right now. Had I found a virtual border crossing, it seemed to me the perfect symbol for our fragile border and the myths and narratives that we use to construct our nation's history. Several clicks later, I found more secret crossings, visual glitches that transformed clear views of the border wall into new abstract clusters of broken pixels. This new vision of the American border wall, fragile, unfixed, and prone to glitches, visually echoed the verbal debates that dominated the news cycles. Were our borders malleable, and did this malleability somehow threaten American identity? I visited Calexico dozens of times virtually during the winter of 2017. I slid down First Street over and over again, moving from the still block of Californian driveways into the long line of cars in Mexicali, Mexico, waiting to pass into US territory. As I clicked on the wall at the edge of First Street, my computer froze, flashed a pale brown, and flickered before it settled on the image of a girl on the other side of the wall. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 years old. She leaned languidly out of the passenger side window of what I assumed to be her family's red sedan. It became clear to me that this digital universe reflected real people, not just shadowy human-like forms. Later, I found more unmarked crossings in border towns in states like California and Arizona. Had I crossed the border in a world where a tweet seems as consequential as a courthouse verdict? Had I cracked the system? Furthermore, it was not lost on me that the Google icon of the white hand, not the black hand or the brown hand, enabled me to break through this digital wall and peer into Mexico. I knew that my Google passages were foolishness, irrelevant artist play. Still, I couldn't help but feel like I had unlocked a secret. I was convinced that when I looked at these landscapes, I saw a world in which as an image is as significant or perhaps more significant as the real thing. The virtual photographs reveal just how artificial and intangible our borders actually are. And it was at this point that I really felt like, that what I was doing was really thinking about the possibilities that photography, and I'm including sort of these glitches because they're photographic images after all, they don't operate the way we might think sort of a traditional photographic image operates, but they're photographic images that offer us something else, right? And that this is sort of revealing something that's no less true than something you would take on site. But I was But at this point, sort of after I had spent the winter going over and over again, sort of with these this digital terrain, I felt compelled that the next step was obviously to get on a plane and go down to the physical border and sort of see how vision operated there. And there's this great radio lab. I always play my photo history students. And it's an interview with Errol Morris, the film director. He's an amazing film director. He's also a critic, historian. He's sort of at everything. And he's talking about a very famous photograph called The Valley of Shadow of Death, which was one of the sort of great war photographs very early on. It was during the Crimean War. And he's trying to figure out, sort of trying to unpack what's true about that image, because a lot of the stories about that image is actually was a fabricated image. So there's this moment in the radio lab where he sort of throws his hands in the air, and it's very entertaining to listen to. He says, well, of course, I had to go out, get on a plane and go to the Crimean and try to figure out if this photograph was real. And that was sort of the impetus for me. I was like, wow, look at these images. They let me into this place. They offer something completely different. So what's the real deal like? And obviously I knew that I'd be standing there and I wouldn't be able to like slip through the wall. And yet there's sort of some truth that it offered me. And I sort of had to go on this vision to see what it is and try to figure out photography's relationship to offering sort of, to figure out how photography could sort of give us a new vision of what this American border could be. So now what you're looking at is, so I'm sort of putting out the pieces there. You can start to see how this project's coming together. I have the virtual images, I have the physical images, and then I started to create these screen prints where I screen printed sort of the virtual as well as images of Mexico onto photographic images of the United States. So I'm sort of compressing both the virtual United States and Mexico into one image. So I have these three different strategies that I'm working together. And now sort of at this point, I get this opportunity and lots of time, because we're all stuck in COVID, to start to pull this stuff together and think about, okay, so what does this all amount to? What you're now looking at is sort of the mock-up of the desk jacket, and I think better than the actual photograph of it, you can start to see that mirage of the border wall. This was taken outside of Campo, California. And this was this long stretch of the border wall itself. It's printed, screen printed. The dust jacket is screen printed in translucent ink so that you can really see. So it sort of looks like a mirage. And then of course the holes mimic the holes in the border wall. This is the physical holes in the border wall. So I took these outside Calexico, both of them, not too far from Campo, California. So just looking to make sure. So in this talk, I'm going to sort of try to address both the content of the work, the form of the work, and how it came together in this book, and then really focus on the book itself. Just to give you an idea of actually when I got on the plane and originally flew to San Diego and then started to drive down into the border. I went by myself. I was really just compelled to try to figure out how these digital images represented that I saw online or virtually that I captured from the video stills had a physical relation to the ship to the actual site. I rented a car, I drove into the desert. A couple of times I drove through California and although as far as into Arizona, and would just photograph along the border itself. The border is really patrolled though. You know, even catching a glimpse of the border wall is something that is highly regulated. So what was really interesting is, as a photographer, we know this. We take pictures, and it's a privilege to take a picture. It's a privilege to make an image of a landscape, of a situation, of a person. That is a responsibility and a huge privilege. And we feel that power and that privilege of sight. What I didn't really anticipate was how much the border itself as a landscape and as a terrain also understood inherently the power and privilege of sight. And those border agents, they sit on the peak of all these hills, and their job literally is to watch that line that sometimes it's defined by a wall, sometimes it's just a line that's not even drawn into the sand, but watch that terrain. And so they're really trying to regulate that vision. And that kind of tension between sort of who gets to see and who doesn't, as a photographer, that became sort of so very compelling. It's the terrain that I sort of think about all the time. So seeing it play out in this sort of political space was very eye-opening for me. So when I finally made it to the actual border, and this is the first time that I saw the wall, I was in this little town called Jacumba Hot Springs, which I suppose they have hot springs. It's nothing fancy about it. It's basically like a ranch town. I turned off the highway. I've turned off the main highway and went onto this highway, which was labeled Old Highway 80, and followed. And then as I drove through the town, there was this old handmade sign that sort of had an arrow that pointed that said library. And I could tell by the GPS that it was closer to the border. So I drove down this dirt road into the distance, and I pulled, and maybe half a mile in, literally nothing was around. And I pulled into the side, and I sort of saw the wall sweep down, and there was one car. It was like a 1970s camper trailer that was sort of diagonally perched up across the wall. And I started to get out, and I didn't really notice anything else. It really felt like I was alone. But within maybe 2 minutes, the border agent drove down, and then I noticed, oh, that's where his cooling station is. He basically sits under a tarp and then drives down and talks to anyone who's there. So, you know, what was really striking was that this big wall, the steel wall, just like these, sort of sat in front of me. And then there was these tiny little vignettes of the other side, these tiny little carvings into the wall of the other side itself. And that tension between what you could see and what you couldn't see, and then how your sight was being regulated, was so palpable. So this is sort of the terrain that I started to think about. This is the actual form that the project began to take. So as you can see, I mean, the accordion book itself measures 177 inches wide, so it's about 15 feet. So about 11.5 inches tall. And it's pretty sturdy stock, so it can stand up. It mimics sort of the gait of the wall itself when it's extended, but it also can be read as sort of a proper book with maybe 6 or 7 individual layouts or individual page spreads there. You're working with sort of like a binary system here when you're talking about sort of an accordion book. You have the left side and the right side. You know, I'm talking about a lot of these binaries: Mexico and the United States, virtual and physical. And one of the things I really wanted to get away from in the book design was trying to complicate that sort of sense of binary, sort of opposing sides, because one of the things that the images I try to do in the images is suggest sort of like a disintegration of that, right? That somehow that there isn't, that kind of opposition is artificial and doesn't really exist. So one side of this book, as you can sort of see on through this illustration here, is my photograph. So it's the juxtaposition of the silk screens that compress images of Mexico and the United States into one image. Having the actual visual digital glitches of video captures, and also having the physical photographs that were taken on the physical site, having those all juxtapose and come together. And on the opposite side, having sort of these empty vessels of where those, and you can see these empty rectangles here of where those photographs could exist. There are a couple of those empty vessels that I filled with an image, but for the most part, they're the things left unsaid. They're what you keep, the sort of promises. They're the images that we can't see, right? And then on the back side, there's also a text or a poem, or you could think of it as a collage from the internet of all the different sort of facts and figures that sort of go into the border itself. Here is the front of the book. Just to give you an idea, my work as a photographer and as an artisan and as a visual thinker has for many years focused on the American landscape as it relates to themes of national identity and American history. I'm particularly interested in how images shape American perception of the landscape, history, and political terrain. For centuries, photography has been equated with vision, but we know now, and of course we always have known this, that the world of images looks and operates differently from the world that we experience through sight. I am interested in mining the slippage between sight, experience, and imaging. And that's what I think what really sort of finding those digital glitches and then seeing how sight played out on the border. That's what sort of brought me to the project, and that's sort of what governed some of these design choices here. So you can see the images themselves, they're two different varying sizes, and they kind of become building blocks or the physicality of the wall itself. They are against not just sort of a neutral white background, but a collage of the physical wall as photographed in the various pieces that are sort of has a translucency to it. So there's a lot of texture to looking at this work, and there's a lot of layers to looking at the work, but it sort of comes together into a physical edifice. So this is the quote, and I'm gonna sort of, before we go through all the images of the book, I'm gonna put this is how I end my essay in Afterimage. This is, I think, a really good point in terms of thinking about what the Artivism, as Carolina and Professor Lake and RG have come up, have sort of put this conference together, and what sort of how I feel my work offers sort of a new vision of what sort of how this American landscape could operate. So at the end of my Afterimage essay, I sort of think about like imaging in relationship to the hard reality of of all these people who are crossing into the United States, and all the politics and, you know, the border patrol agents and the real people. And sort of I'm thinking about theoretically these ideas, and that's a lot to sort of try to negotiate in my head, because, you know, after all, this isn't just sort of a poetic expression, this is real life here. So sort of this is where I ended my essay. Since my trips out west, the politics on the southern border have intensified. And I wrote this in 2019, sort of was clarified in 2020. So Trump is still president. Obviously, the border has been in the news recently with so many unaccompanied minors coming in, and the Biden administration trying to figure out how to account for them, what to do with this influx of young people. But sort of for now, when I wrote this was during the Trump administration. So since my trips out west, the politics on the southern border have intensified. News of the detention camps and their devastating conditions have played out in mainstream media. 7,000 migrant children have been separated from their parents. Civilians leaving food and water for the passing migrants have been arrested. A Salvadorian father and his daughter were found dead on the banks of the Rio Grande. In a world where physical consequences can be so brutal, what kind of truth can the virtual offer us? Perhaps photography in all its digital incarnations, and I'm including the virtual in this sort of definition of photography in the 21st century. So perhaps photography no longer holds a mirror up to our world. And that was the promise of photography at the very beginning, right? That it offered us a mirror onto the world, but instead offers us some surprising alternatives about how we can imagine and operate in our landscape. After all, the video stills that I have extracted from Google Earth suggest that what can happen when we shift the boundaries, break down the walls, and arm individual citizens with unrestrained vision. So here's the individual vignettes. This is sort of going through the book. This little paragraph at the beginning sets up the the situation. So taking the digital captures and then juxtaposing them with the actual screen prints and images. And then here, going through and looking at the double page spreads when it's not extended, you can see how the formal choices I'm making, as well as sort of some of the things, the physical things I'm looking at. I'm looking at the holes, I'm looking at the digital glitches, I'm looking at what's seen and what can't be seen. I'm looking at how my vision driving in a car, standing on the ground, gets truncated by the physical terrain or by the ways in which I'm viewing it. So how the car is framing the actual border itself, or how the reflection of the border looks, or how far the distance looks away, or how the environment obscures the border. And so I'm sort of placing these things in relationship to one another, and no image can be seen sort of in singularity, but instead it's sort of this this vision of multiple different strategies and ways of looking that gives us sort of a more holistic view of the border itself. And those were some of the design choices here. These are the individual images that you can see and you can pull out from these individual these page spreads. So, you know, as I said, standing at the foot of the wall where you have the view of the border agent, your view looking up, you know, you hear voices on the other side, you can't see them. Sort of this way of compartmentalizing the rectangle here and thinking about sort of overlaying on a traditional photograph, overlaying sort of obstructions and wall and texture, that sort of informed how I was making the image itself. This is looking through the rear side, the wing mirror on the car itself. And again, sort of that separation, you can see Mexico in the distance, that separation between wall and the vehicle in which that's framing my vision, and how our visions are truncated by sort of our own perspective, right? That was so palpable when I was on site. In this image, I have literally like a scene from, I think this was from the digital border that's silk screened on the back. So you're sort of you're not even looking at sort of a straight photograph of Mexico on the other side. So it's sort of like what you see gets sort of reinterpreted. These are the silk screens themselves. I silk screened the wall running perpendicular to this sort of open field that was adjacent to the border. So thinking about sort of, you know, how arbitrary it is. It's really, it's amazing standing at the foot and hearing of the wall and hearing voices. Like these are a lot of this terrain is really sort of vast, open desert. So there's not many people around, but you can hear things. You can hear chicken. You can hear a voice. Maybe you can hear a car in the distance, and you can't see it. And that sense of obstruction of sight is sort of palpable. So these are some of the things that I was thinking about as I was making the images, and hopefully it brings it together into the book form where you can start to imagine this stuff. So this is the texture, the dirt on the car. This was the wall that ran, this is a road that ran adjacent to the border wall. I should say I made 3 trips to the border. And then the last one was right before Christmas of 2019. And of course, 2020, everything shut down. I haven't been back, but I do feel like this, along with the essay that I wrote, this book is sort of the culmination of a lot of these ideas that I had been wrestling with. So what you're looking at now is the reverse side. So you can see these empty vessels, and you can see the digital glitches. So while the front side shows the physical border wall, these show the digital glitch. This has the running views of these collage-like digital glitches, where you can start to see the landscape folding in on each other, and cars sort of appear upside down, and things sort of are bent around in 360 views when they should be sort of flat. So it doesn't operate the way that we think of a traditional photograph. And this is where I have this poem, and I happen to be lucky. I think every artist or photographer should have a graphic designer as a spouse. And so I'm lucky that I have such a good graphic designer as my spouse who helped me with the type. I love layout and I love design, but type is sort of above my purview here. So she really laid out the type. So we're thinking about sort of that sense of opposition. The type itself, and this is how I'm going to end the talk here. I'm going to read you the text that is sort of a collage from all these internet sources. Everything's footnoted in the book. That's sort of part of the poem. It operates as a poem. It operates as sort of a facts that inform how we see the border. It's really necessary to bring this vision together and to talk about power can control as it exists in this landscape, and to sort of hopefully offer us a new way of sort of operating in that landscape. So this is the text. And again, none of it's sort of original. It's all lifted. I've added some words and some ideas, but I've shaped it into a poem, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But you know, the more I sort of think about the poem and I read it out loud, I hear sort of the beat poetry from the 1950s in it, sort of that cadence and that idea of reshaping America, like Allen Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti, for those people who know the beat poetry. And if you think about Robert Frank, who was a very famous photographer who doesn't take pictures at all like me, but did this amazing book called The Americans. It's sort of a cliche for a photographer to reference Robert Frank because it was so influential in terms of rethinking the country at that time in 1950s America. But sort of this idea that America isn't what we thought it was and has sort of possibilities for the future. I think that sort of notion of the beats sort of inspired me and plays out in sort of this very different contemporary version of what America could be. And also, obviously, I'm female, and the beat poetry is really sort of situated in sort of a male conversation. So it's sort of interesting as I sort of listen to the poem. So I'm going to read this to you, and this is what's snaking through the backside of the book. So in a filing on November 13th, 2017, in federal court in Washington, D.C., DOJ lawyers wrote that Trump's tweets are official statements of the President of the United States. So that's footnoted, for instance. And then it goes, the United States of America, 50 states, 1 federal district, 5 major self-governing territories, and various possessions, 3.8 million square miles, with a 2019 population of over 328 million, including 3,145 kilometers of southern borderland, 2,000 miles of border country, 354 miles of pedestrian barriers, 300 more miles of anti-vehicle fencing, only partially photographed and pictured on Google, where pixel coordinate equals pixel coordinate times 2 times zoom level. And that was just code taken out of the images. Where Tecate is canvas width equals 1450, height equals 1463, ID class, widget, scene, class, size, style, width 580 pixels, height 584 pixels. And in 2018, 837,643,000 pedestrians crossed over the Tecate border, where Calexico is a mouse over. And this was code lifted from the actual image. Scene, viewpoint, click, scene, viewpoint, mouse down, scene, viewpoint, mouse over. I'm not going to read this whole lift because it is more of a visual experience than actual auditory one, but you get the idea. And time is still measured in clicks and ticks and tweets, where on 12/12/19, the president clocked over 58 tweets in 1 hour, an average of 1 tweet every 62 seconds, and boasted 110 million digital followers. Where Nogales, Arizona is source code, null, where we count the years by fiscal, lunar, and leap, and in 2018 tallied 96,448 people booked into ICE custody, 242,778 people were detained by CBP, 153,670 by ICE's own enforcement operations. Today at 12:26 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the president records 51,329 tweets, 895 deleted tweets, 1,284 days in office, 30,825 hours, 1,849,556 minutes, 110,973,409 seconds. The United States of America, where we continue to count, code, and chart. And this is the layout of the whole book. So the hope is that the text, the images, the different 3 strategies of images, the text, the collages in the background, these sort of empty vessels, the physical presence of the book itself starts to ask us to reimagine the border. And that somehow this digital terrain, which we've all spent too much time in this last year and a half, so we know how much now we exist in the digital, right? We have taught classes, we have played, well, my kids have played countless hours of video games. They've talked to friends, like this digital terrain is the real deal. And that it offers us sort of a new way of imagining what this landscape could be. I think there's something to be learned from it. And there's a way of thinking about sort of that truth that photography sort of promised us in its very beginnings. And we always knew that was a fantasy, that photography doesn't operate the way real experience operates, but we put so much stake into that truth of how photography can operate. So when we look at all these images together and we think about sort of those statistics, and you can see my images don't have any people in them, and all those people who've been through this landscape, how can we reimagine this land so that it sort of operates in more humane ways? So that's it. Thank you. This was fun. I really enjoyed it, presenting it. And, you learn a lot from talking through this stuff. So hopefully I kept you entertained.
Amazing, Hannah. Thank you so much. Your work is so impactful, and hearing you speak about the process is absolutely so enlightening. So thank you for being our artivist for today. So before I open up the floor for questions, we ask you to participate in the short poll that's going to be up on your screen. So while you guys are doing that, I would like to announce the next couple of events in the Artivism series. So we have the Clothesline Project, which will take place this Thursday, April 22nd at 4 p.m. And the Intervention Indigo Protest, Mutual Aid, and Reciprocity, which will take place Monday, April 26th at 5:30 p.m. So for more information on this and all the series of events, go to the website adelphi.edu/artivism. You can follow them on their Instagram, Artivism4, the number, Shared Humanity, or you can simply Google Artivism Adelphi. They're also hosting an open call installation for creative thinkers on their Instagram. So if you'd like to get more involved in the year-long initiative, contact Stephanie Lake or Carolina. So with that being said, I would like to open up the floor.
Okay, I have one thing. As much as I consider myself a visual person, your narrative, your storytelling really painted the picture for me even more than the photographs. It was amazing. I felt like I was a part of that journey. It was beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, the essay I wrote is really part of the work, but I hope that the text on the back of it sort of serves it without being like, the text I wrote that was published in Afterimage is really sort of theoretical, even though it's personal. So I really wanted to try to pull out some of that, not have that theoretical language in the artwork itself. So I hope that the poem sort of gets at that without always coming to the conclusion. I want, I think a good piece of artwork that at least those that engage me allow for room for the viewer to really come to that conclusion. So I sort of left some of that theoretical language out of the book itself. But thank you. I love storytelling, and that's sort of.
It's like I would almost want a podcast to go along with the book. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
I have a question. Do you feel like this project is concluded, or are you going to go back and do like a part 2 or any kind of continuation?
I feel like the project is done for what it is. Like it's like if I'm really thinking about the American landscape in this, I mean, there's so many other stories to be told, and any good, I think any good subject that really captures you, there's so many different ways to tell the story too. So it could do another project on it. My work, like I wish, sometimes you always wish you were somebody else, right? And I wish I was, there's so much important, obviously important work to do on the border. And, I also know my own limitations as a person. So I have to be real about sort of what I'm able to accomplish and what I hope to do. But there's certainly other stories to tell on the border that maybe will take me back someday. I mean, partly, COVID kind of got in the way and there's no more going back right now. So maybe soon, but like certainly a year and a half, there was no going back. So who knows? But I think that in terms of like thinking about sort of how that space has been pictured and how vision plays out in that space, like I came to, with that essay and the book, I came to sort of a resolution on that. So then maybe there's another story there. Or maybe there's just another story about another American landscape in another place. Because one thing that I've really realized, through all the projects I've done, is that this country is so different depending where you are and how people operate. And so there's a lot of stories to be told there.
Thank you.
I'll ask a question. Hi, Hannah.
Hey.
Thanks for this. It's super interesting, and I can't wait to see the book. It shipped. Visual Studies Workshop said it's shipped, so I'm excited to see it. It struck me when you talked about seeing the child, and I can't remember whether it was like a Google image, right? It wasn't one of the images you took, and like a border separates humans and nature across two sides, but you chose landscape as your medium to express that. And I don't know, I think that really struck me. And then when you mentioned this image of a kid, that struck me as well. And so can you talk about like the place of pictures of people in this work? Like, are there any images of humans? And if not, like, can you talk about that decision?
There aren't any. And like, I think, I don't feel equipped, like at least the way I was going through it, I don't feel equipped to try to tell those stories at this point. Like there are lots of stories to be told, and they're really important, and there are great photographers and great artists doing work like that. But that's sort of, I really was thinking about sort of the nature of images and how that landscape is described. And I think that one of the things as I went through putting the book together, as I was very conscious of not having any images of people, and I didn't want to use images of people on Google Earth either, because I really did want it to be about like sort of the potential of the landscape in general. But also what I really liked is how the poem talks about the thousands of people who crossed over. I mean, like literally 300, 700,000 in 1 year, like literally walking over just this one port of crossing, and sort of the lack of people in the landscape. It's really palpable how deserted most of this landscape is. I mean, it's desert, nobody's around. There's like a border agent and that's it. Maybe a hiker, maybe some people crossing over illicitly, right? But like you see these people, but nobody talks to each other because it's not that kind of environment. And if they do, they are questioning you. I mean, I got pulled over a couple times, there's no trust in that area. And it's really it's like, I'm not sort of exaggerating there, like vision and sort of like who owns those sites and who can see that stuff is really regulated. So as a photographer, that was really interesting to me. And it sort of became, I'm shy. So it's also like an easy way to say like, okay, well, this I have to focus this somehow. And now now I can be kind of quiet about it. I mean, that doesn't mean I didn't engage. I talked to a bunch of people and had really interesting conversations and like some uncomfortable moments with border agents, but like and I talk about that in the essay, but I also really like to have moments that aren't mediated through photography with people. I find it very hard to always try to mediate my relationships with people through photography. So that's a personal thing. Not everyone's like that. Some people do such a great job of like being themselves with the camera, but that's not me. So.
Thanks.
Hannah, I have a question for you. You talked about hearing things at the border. Did that impact your work while you were in that process, or did it make you think differently about it at all?
Well, sometimes you can see through it. I should be clear, like there's different, I mean, it's not different materials, but there's different ways the border wall is constructed. So like in Calexico, you can literally see people walking back and forth and it's sort of like shadows, but you can see it because there are like rods, right? And other times the border wall is flat in itself and then there's just little holes. So about hearing things, I've recorded like I was standing at the foot of the border wall in the middle of the desert and I recorded some sounds of chickens because I was so interested in that sound and how I heard the chickens so clearly, but there was this giant wall literally in front of me that didn't allow me to see it. So like I was interested in that. I'm sure it influenced me, but I never quite did anything. Like I don't know how I put that into a visual form. You guys can see at this point, like I operate in the idea. I start with the idea, and then like the problem is like, how do I have these ideas come together into a visual form? So that's like the problem. I definitely do. There's a lot of me that does work from instinct, but it's sort of like I wrestle with the idea and the visual form. So I never figured out sort of how to make that dissonance between what you hear and what you can't see play out visually.
I wanted to jump in. I was a little bit late, so unfortunately I didn't see the first part. But it's really striking that, I mean, you talk about, we're all mediated for a year and a half or whatever it is now. And then even you being mediated from your project, like being there versus the actual, now this book, how do you feel about how is it different, the experience being there versus now looking back on your work?
Well, the work was always about the mediation, right? Because it grew out of like looking at the border via Google Earth and wondering like this phenomenal, like kind of crazy phenomenon, whether it was by design or not, that like sort of offered a new way of like imagining the landscape. So it's always been mediated. And, like I took 3 trips, like I wouldn't say like I am by any, that's not my home or that's like, it was always sort of this disjointed vision because I was just looking and experiencing it. So to me, the book sort of visualizes, I guess that's the best word, visualizes that kind of dissonance that I feel with that place. And I should say, like, it's probably, the book is probably more about like how images, what images reveal, whether any kind of images reveal about the landscape down there, the border landscape. And that's always been true in my work. It's always about sort of how images make something look. And because we invest so much in images themselves, right? And we invest, when I always tell my photo students, like one day, you have all those cameras when you're running red lights that sort of are there to get you. And I've never run a red light, so I wouldn't know. No, I've run many red lights and I've gotten, actually there's one right over here on the corner of Nassau and Hempstead. And I've gotten that one many times. But when you run the red lights, they still send you a photograph of your little license plate going through the red light symbol, and you're like, wait a second, it takes 2 seconds to change that red to green in Photoshop. What are they using this as evidence for? Photography does that. I have a hard time imagining a world in which a photograph isn't presented as part of sort of the package of truth, right? So I forgot what the nexus of this question was, but point being, my work has always been about sort of like this slippery point that the images, when seen in different contexts, really change their meaning and shape sort of alternative ways that we view or understand the world that we live in. So the book to me just encapsulates some of that disassociation I had, whether I was on site or in person. Does that make sense, Dan?
No, totally, yeah. And it's funny to me that, you know, it's like, right, our world now, we're just seeing each other through screens, and it's so for the non-photographers, they're sort of experiencing what you're talking about that you've, you know, cultivated over these years.
Right. No, I think more than ever, we've really embraced this screen world, right? This digital world, and there's real consequences in it. And I think, you know, that's something I've learned with this year and a half too. There's real consequences in this sort of vision of this digital flat vision of the world that we look at now almost every day, right? Consistently, constantly on Zoom.
Any other questions or comments?
I'm just interested, Hannah, what's next for you?
I don't know. I have a couple ideas. I have a friend who I was ranting and raving, as I normally do, about, I don't know if I should say it, but I really, well, maybe I'll say it out loud, because maybe then I'll do it. I'm like, in this digital world, I've just like, I can't, like, I haven't found my my relationship to teaching. I just don't, it doesn't click with me. And but I think that this, like, we're gonna have to figure some of this out in terms of how to really incorporate sort of Zoom and the little boxes I experience you all in, and the ways that we can find sort of an intimacy on this thing. It's hard for me to give a lecture on Zoom and to really feel like I'm connecting with people. But so one of the things that I've thought about, and a friend of mine suggested, is really thinking about sort of the landscape, because I want to sort of continue to think about landscape, but of education, and how this sort of the ways that we've physically defined stuff like the campus or the public school building, and how it's built into an environment, and then sort of how it can how it exists, I don't know, in this kind of space. It's wacky. I've been thinking about that a lot recently. And I've been thinking about all these like strange outside platforms that we devise that people don't really use that much to teach outside, and how odd those things are. So that could be an interesting thing to photograph. So who knows, but I'm thinking about some of that stuff.
What an evening. Thank you, Professor Allen, for such an inspirational presentation today. Artivism, the Power of Art for Social Transformation, is an initiative that now it's scheduled until spring 2022. So anyone in the audience that would like to be also one of the presenters, please just reach out. Also in that regard, it is sponsored by Adelphi University, Gottesman's Libraries, Teachers College, Columbia University, and Sing for Hope. And before we part for today, Professor Allen, I mean, you have done such an excellent work today, showing your passion, and through it, giving us that insight into quiet, slow down artivism that you pointed out to. A key takeaway, just one out of all the many that you have brought up to us today, what would be one for our audience so that they can have that passion that will ignite that change that we're looking for in society today?
I think you gotta, I do think that you have, like, for me, I have to, like, for work to be worthwhile, it's got to be contemporary, it's got to be present, it's got to be relevant. And I think that you really have to care about it. You can't just sort of own an idea and just say, wow, this is kind of clever. But you kind of really have to live it and feel it. And if you live it and feel it, and you sort of, you're like, when I talked about Errol Morris, who had to jump on the plane and go to the Crimean, I kind of feel like that kind of just curiosity about the world is part of what makes things really not only personally worthwhile, but it's infectious, and hopefully like inspires other people to reimagine, right, what the way the world can operate for them. So